Some rides end at your destination, others take you somewhere you never expected to go but exactly where you needed to be. Justice Michael had learned was often a journey that began with someone brave enough to challenge a system that seemed impossible to change. The woman who'd dismissed him as an immigrant scammer had inadvertently provided him with the evidence needed to transform an entire industry's approach to civil rights. And he was just getting started. Absolutely not. Find another way home. I don't pay surge pricing to some immigrant Uber driver. Senior partner. Victoria Sterling's voice sliced through the marble lobby of the Grand Metroplex Hotel like a legal brief filed in fury. She stood in her $3,000 Armani suit, glaring down at the man holding the phone displaying her ride request. Michael Thompson looked up from his smartphone with dark eyes that had seen 23 years of federal courtrooms presided over cases that shaped civil rights law and sentenced criminals who thought they were above justice. What Victoria didn't know was that the immigrant Uber driver she was refusing to pay was actually Judge Michael Thompson of the Federal District Court working undercover to investigate discrimination complaints that could shut down her entire law firm. Tonight's anniversary party for Sterling Blackwood and Associates was supposed to celebrate 40 years of legal excellence. Instead, it was about to become the night Victoria destroyed her career by humiliating the wrong man. Ma'am, the surge pricing is automatically calculated based on demand, Michael said quietly, his voice carrying just a trace of the accent that had followed him from El Salvador 35 years ago. It's $47.50 for the trip to Highland Park. Toot, $47. Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. I could buy groceries for a week with that money. You people always try to rip off customers after events like this. The phrase "you people" hung in the luxury hotel's air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Around them, other law firm partners and their spouses moved through the lobby in designer evening wear, most pretending not to notice the confrontation, but some watching with the predatory interest that lawyers brought to any conflict. Michael absorbed the insult without flinching, but something shifted behind his calm expression. A calculation, a decision being made by someone who'd spent decades protecting civil rights from exactly this kind of casual cruelty. I understand your concern about the pricing, he replied steadily. Would you prefer to wait for the surge to decrease? I'd prefer not to be scammed by someone who probably doesn't even have legal documentation to work in this country. Victoria snapped loud enough for the lobby to hear clearly. Several partners stopped their conversation, sensing drama. Michael noticed their faces, some showing discomfort at Victoria's obvious prejudice, others nodding in agreement with her assumptions about his immigration status. What none of them could see was Michael discreetly opening a voice recording app on his phone. As a federal judge investigating Sterling Blackwood and Associates for systematic discrimination in hiring and client services, every word Victoria spoke was now being documented as evidence. Michael had come to tonight's anniversary party not as a party crasher, but as the lead investigator in a Department of Justice civil rights probe. For 3 months, his court had been receiving complaints about the firm's treatment of Latino clients, immigrant families, and minority job applicants. The complaints painted a picture of institutional bias that went straight to the top of the firm's power structure. Tonight was his chance to see that culture in action, unfiltered by the careful language of legal filings and HR policies. "Ma'am," Michael said, slipping his phone back into his jacket pocket. "I'm happy to provide the ride at the standard rate if you prefer. I just need to follow the app's pricing structure." Victoria's eyes flashed with something ugly. "Don't try to negotiate with me. I'm a senior partner at one of Dallas's most prestigious law firms. I know my rights, and I know when someone is trying to take advantage of me." "Of course," Michael replied. "I wouldn't want to compromise your professional standing." But as Victoria continued her tirade, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Department of Justice attorney Sarah Martinez. "Michael, final evidence packet ready for tomorrow's hearing. Your undercover assessment will complete our case file. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Michael would return to his real role as federal judge presiding over Sterling Blackwood and Associates' civil rights hearing. The firm had no idea that their pattern of discrimination was about to face federal scrutiny. They especially had no idea that the judge hearing their case had spent the evening documenting their senior partner's behavior firsthand. Michael looked around the hotel lobby, noting details. The casual segregation of the evening Latino service staff moving invisibly, while white lawyers commanded attention. The way Victoria's colleagues either encouraged her behavior or looked away uncomfortably rather than speaking up. The atmosphere of entitlement that suggested this kind of treatment was routine rather than exceptional. "You know what?" Victoria announced loudly. "I'm calling my own car service. At least they employ real Americans who understand customer service." She pulled out her phone and dialed, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, this is Victoria Sterling. I need a car to Highland Park immediately, and make sure you send someone appropriate. I just had a very unpleasant experience with one of these rideshare drivers." The dismissal was complete and public. Around them, other lawyers were beginning to whisper among themselves. Some looked embarrassed by their colleagues' behavior. Others seemed to approve of her firm stance against being overcharged. Michael nodded politely and began walking toward the exit, but his mind was working like the legal strategist he'd been for over 2 decades. Victoria's behavior wasn't just personally offensive, it was evidence of the systematic discrimination that his court would address in less than 18 hours. As he reached the hotel's glass doors, Michael's phone rang. The caller ID showed Chief Justice Roberts, Chambers. He declined the call quickly, but not before a sharp-eyed junior associate named David Park noticed the screen. David frowned, wondering why an Uber driver would be receiving calls from the Supreme Court. But before he could process the implications, Michael had disappeared into the Dallas night. Back in the lobby, Victoria was still holding court, regaling her colleagues with her tale of standing up to aggressive rideshare pricing and immigrant drivers who don't understand American business practices. "You have to be firm with these people," she declared. "Give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. That's why our firm maintains such high standards. We don't tolerate being taken advantage of by anyone." Her audience nodded approvingly, completely unaware that their senior partner had just provided a federal judge with perfect evidence of the discriminatory attitudes that would destroy their firm's reputation and potentially end careers. What Victoria didn't know was that the man she'd dismissed as an immigrant scammer held her professional future in his hands. That tomorrow he would sit behind a federal bench with the power to impose sanctions order investigations and mandate changes that would fundamentally alter how her firm operated. That the Uber driver who'd been too patient, too polite, too willing to absorb her insults without fighting back was actually one of the most respected civil rights judges in the federal system. Victoria Sterling had just humiliated federal Judge Michael Thompson, and tomorrow she would learn exactly how expensive that mistake would be. But tonight she felt victorious. She'd maintained her standards, protected her principles, and shown everyone in that lobby exactly who held the power in every interaction. Tomorrow would teach her that sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones about people who seem to have no power at all. The immigrant Uber driver was about to become the federal judge who would decide her fate, and Victoria had just given him every reason to ensure that justice was both blind and absolutely decisive. Some rides take you where you want to go. Others take you exactly where you need to be. Michael Thompson was about to deliver justice to Victoria Sterling's door, whether she wanted it or not. Victoria Sterling's private car service arrived within 15 minutes. A black Mercedes with a white driver in a pressed uniform who addressed her as ma'am, with the appropriate deference she expected. As she settled into the leather seats, Victoria felt the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully maintained standards in a world that seemed increasingly determined to lower them. What she didn't see was Michael Thompson sitting in his own vehicle across the street finishing his documentation of the evening's events. His phone contained not just the audio recording of Victoria's tirade, but photographs of the law firm's anniversary party, notes about the firm's demographic composition, and observations about the systematic exclusion he'd witnessed throughout the evening. Michael had spent 3 hours inside that hotel ballroom, moving invisibly among Dallas's legal elite, watching how they interacted with service staff, listening to their conversations about hiring practices and client selection. The evidence he'd gathered went far beyond Victoria's personal bigotry. It revealed an institutional culture that had normalized discrimination to the point where partners felt comfortable expressing prejudice publicly. His phone buzzed with a message from DOJ attorney Sarah Martinez. "Michael, how extensive was the evidence gathering tonight?" He typed back, "Comprehensive. Pattern established beyond reasonable doubt. Recommend proceeding with full investigation." Back in her Mercedes, Victoria was already on the phone with her assistant Linda Hartwell despite the late hour. "Linda, I want you to document something for our client service review. These rideshare companies are becoming increasingly problematic. Drivers who don't understand American business practices, aggressive pricing tactics, possible immigration status issues." Through the phone, Linda's voice sounded uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sterling, should I be noting specific demographic concerns?" "Use your judgment," Victoria replied with the kind of verbal code that had protected the firm from direct discrimination claims for decades. "We need to ensure our clients receive service from appropriate providers." The conversation continued for 10 minutes, with Victoria providing a detailed critique of urban transportation issues that was barely disguised prejudice wrapped in professional language. What she didn't know was that her phone calls from company vehicles were routinely monitored as part of the federal investigation, and every word was being transcribed by Justice Department analysts. Michael followed Victoria's Mercedes through the Dallas streets, documenting the route to Highland Park, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, where mansion-lined streets spoke of inherited wealth and generational privilege. This wasn't just about one woman's bias. It was about a social structure that protected discrimination by calling it standards. At 11:47 p.m., Victoria's car pulled into the circular driveway of a colonial mansion that probably cost more than most people earned in a decade. Michael parked at a discreet distance and watched as Victoria tipped her driver, a gesture she'd refused to extend to someone she'd perceived as unworthy of basic respect. As Victoria disappeared into her mansion, Michael's phone rang with a call that would have terrified her if she'd known about it. "Judge Thompson, this is Attorney General Roberts' office. Tomorrow's hearing has been elevated to priority status. Media coverage is expected." Michael accepted the call as he drove back toward downtown Dallas. "Sarah, what's the timeline for tomorrow?" "Our proceedings begin at 2 p.m. Sterling Blackwood and Associates will be represented by their senior partners, including Victoria Sterling herself. They have no idea about your undercover assessment." "Good," Michael replied. "The evidence is more extensive than we anticipated. This isn't just individual bias. It's institutional discrimination that reaches the highest levels of their organization." The next morning arrived with Victoria feeling triumphant and vindicated. She'd successfully navigated another firm's social event, maintained her standards in a challenging situation, and demonstrated the kind of principled leadership that had made Sterling Blackwood and Associates one of Dallas's most prestigious legal institutions. At 9 a.m., she was reviewing case files in her corner office when her assistant knocked urgently. "Mrs. Sterling, there's been a development. The federal hearing this afternoon, it's not just about our hiring practices. The Justice Department has expanded their investigation to include systematic discrimination in client services and public interactions." Victoria frowned. "What does that mean?" "They're claiming we have a pattern of bias that extends beyond employment issues. They mentioned documented evidence of discriminatory behavior by senior leadership." For the first time, Victoria felt a flicker of unease, but her confidence quickly reasserted itself. She'd been careful. Her firm had followed all legal protocols. Whatever evidence the DOJ thought they had, it couldn't be substantial enough to threaten a law firm with Sterling Blackwood's reputation and resources. Linda, prepare our full discrimination defense file and call our media relations consultant. We may need to manage some publicity. What Victoria didn't know was that 3 floors above her office in the federal courthouse, Judge Michael Thompson was reviewing the evidence package that would determine her professional future. The audio recordings, witness statements, pattern analysis, and documentation of institutional bias painted a picture that would shock even the most jaded civil rights attorneys. At 1:30 p.m., Victoria arrived at the federal courthouse in her armor of Armani and authority, flanked by 3 junior partners and 2 paralegals. She moved through the marble corridors with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case that mattered, never faced consequences that couldn't be appealed or negotiated away. Remember, she told her team as they approached the courtroom, this is about hiring statistics and policy interpretation. We maintain that our standards are based on qualifications, not demographics. We've done nothing wrong. At 1:58 p.m., Victoria took her seat at the defendant's table, reviewing her notes one final time. Around her, the courtroom filled with DOJ attorneys, civil rights advocates, and media representatives. The attention was flattering, further proof of her firm's importance in Dallas's legal landscape. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the bailiff announced, "All rise," the Honorable Judge Michael Thompson presiding. Victoria stood with everyone else, her eyes focused on her legal documents rather than the bench. "You may be seated," came a voice from the front of the courtroom. Victoria looked up and found herself staring directly into the calm, dark eyes of the immigrant Uber driver she'd humiliated less than 18 hours earlier. The blood drained from Victoria Sterling's face as she stared at the federal bench. The man she'd dismissed as an immigrant scammer was seated behind the massive oak podium, wearing judicial robes, commanding the respect of an entire courtroom, holding her professional future in his hands. "Your Honor," DOJ attorney Sarah Martinez began, but Victoria couldn't hear the words. Her mind was spinning through every insult, every assumption, every moment of casual cruelty she'd displayed in that hotel lobby. Judge Michael Thompson looked down at her with the same calm expression he'd maintained while she'd berated him about surge pricing and immigration status. But now that expression carried the weight of federal authority. "Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly, "I believe we met briefly last evening." The courtroom fell silent. Victoria's junior partners turned to look at her in confusion. The media representatives leaned forward, sensing a story that was about to become legendary. Your Honor," Victoria managed to whisper, I don't understand. Last night you refused rideshare service from someone you assumed was probably illegal and trying to scam American customers. You recommended hiring only real Americans for transportation services. Each word fell like a gavel strike. Around Victoria, her legal team was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. "Your Honor," junior partner David Park said desperately, "surely there's been some misunderstanding." "Mr. Park," Judge Thompson interrupted, "there's been no misunderstanding. For the past 3 months, this court has been investigating systematic discrimination at Sterling Blackwood and Associates. Last evening, I conducted undercover observation of your firm's leadership in an uncontrolled environment." Victoria tried to speak, to explain, to somehow undo the catastrophic error she'd made, but no words came. The evidence gathered, Judge Thompson continued, includes audio recordings of discriminatory statements, witness testimony about institutional bias, and documentation of patterns that violate federal civil rights statutes. Sarah Martinez stood up. "Your Honor, the Department of Justice is prepared to present comprehensive evidence of discrimination in hiring client services and partnership decisions spanning the past 5 years. Victoria found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding last night. I didn't realize—" "Mrs. Sterling." Judge Thompson's voice was gentle but implacable. "This isn't about realizing who I was. This is about how you treated someone you believed had no power to challenge you. The distinction hit the courtroom like lightning. This wasn't about mistaken identity or social awkwardness. This was about institutional prejudice being exposed by someone with the authority to demand justice. Furthermore, too, Judge Thompson continued opening a file. Your phone conversation in the company vehicle following our interaction provided additional evidence of systematic discrimination disguised as service standards. Victoria's face went white. The company cars were monitored. Every word she'd said to Linda about appropriate providers and demographic concerns had been recorded as evidence. Around her, the junior partners were beginning to distance themselves physically and psychologically. David Park was frantically taking notes. The paralegals looked terrified. The firm's reputation was collapsing in real time. Your Honor. Victoria tried once more. Sterling Blackwood and Associates has always maintained the highest legal and ethical standards. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Thompson interrupted. Would you like me to play the audio recording from last evening? The threat silenced her completely. Every insult, every assumption, every moment of documented prejudice would be heard by the media, recorded in federal transcripts, and preserved forever in legal precedent. The court, Judge Thompson announced, will now hear evidence regarding systematic discrimination at Sterling Blackwood and Associates. For the next 2 hours, Victoria sat in humiliated silence as the DOJ presented a devastating case. Audio recordings of partner meetings where minority candidates were dismissed as not our kind of lawyers. Email chains discussing how to discourage certain types of clients. Statistical analysis showing that the firm's diversity claims were fiction designed to avoid federal scrutiny. And at the center of it all, the audio from the hotel lobby, Victoria's own voice providing perfect evidence of the mindset that had shaped every discriminatory decision. You people always try to rip off customers. Someone who probably doesn't even have legal documentation. At least they employ real Americans. Each quote was a nail in the coffin of her career, her firm's reputation, and everything she'd spent 25 years building. When the evidence presentation concluded, Judge Thompson looked directly at Victoria. Mrs. Sterling, how do you respond to these allegations? Victoria stood on shaking legs, her mind blank of everything except the magnitude of her mistake. She'd humiliated a federal judge. She'd provided him with personal evidence of her prejudice. She'd handed him the tools to destroy everything she cared about. Your Honor, she whispered, I have no adequate response. It was the first honest thing she'd said in the entire proceeding. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute as Judge Michael Thompson reviewed the evidence files spread before him. Victoria Sterling sat at the defendant's table, her 25-year legal career dissolving like sugar in rain. Tonight, Mrs. Sterling, Judge Thompson said finally, in addition to the documented evidence of institutional discrimination, your personal conduct last evening reveals the mindset that has shaped your firm's culture. Victoria tried one final time to salvage something from the wreckage. Your Honor, I deeply regret my words and actions. If the court would consider... Mrs. Sterling, Judge Thompson interrupted gently. I want you to understand something. Your treatment of me wasn't offensive because I'm a federal judge. It was offensive because I'm a human being. The problem isn't that you didn't recognize my authority. The problem is that you didn't recognize my dignity. The distinction echoed through the courtroom like a bell. This wasn't about disrespecting a judge. This was about the casual dehumanization that enabled systematic discrimination. The evidence before this court, Judge Thompson continued, demonstrates that Sterling Blackwood and Associates has operated as an institution that systematically excludes, diminishes, and discriminates against individuals based on race, national origin, and perceived economic status. He opened the formal judgment file. This court hereby orders the following immediate sanctions. Victoria's hands trembled as she took notes, each word a death blow to her professional world. The first, Sterling Blackwood and Associates will pay $2.3 million in fines for civil rights violations. The junior partners exchanged panicked glances. That was nearly a quarter of their annual profit. Second, the firm will undergo complete restructuring of hiring, promotion, and client service practices under federal oversight. Third, all senior partners, including Mrs. Sterling, will complete comprehensive civil rights training and sensitivity education. Fourth, the firm will establish a $500,000 fund for legal aid services to immigrant and minority communities. Each sanction was a precision strike designed to force cultural change rather than simply impose punishment. But Judge Thompson wasn't finished. Additionally, he said, looking directly at Victoria, Mrs. Sterling will personally undergo a minimum of 200 hours of community service with immigrant advocacy organizations. Victoria's world was collapsing, but the worst was still coming. Finally, Judge Thompson announced, "This court is referring Mrs. Sterling's conduct to the State Bar Association for review of professional ethics violations. The recorded evidence of discriminatory statements may warrant disciplinary action up to and including disbarment." The word disbarment hit Victoria like a physical blow. Not just sanctions or fines, but the potential end of her legal career entirely. Furthermore, Judge Thompson continued, this case will be forwarded to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for additional investigation into hiring practices at major Dallas law firms. The implications rippled beyond Sterling, Blackwood, and Associates. Other firms would face scrutiny. The entire legal industry in Dallas would be forced to examine its practices. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Thompson said directly, "Your behavior last evening wasn't an isolated incident. It was a window into institutional discrimination that this court will not tolerate." Victoria stood slowly, her legs barely supporting her weight. "Your Honor, I accept full responsibility for my actions and their consequences." Mrs. Sterling, to Judge Thompson, replied, "Responsibility isn't just accepting consequences, it's committing to change." As the hearing concluded and the media rushed to file their stories, Victoria found herself alone in the courthouse hallway with her junior partners. David Park, who'd worked under her for 5 years, looked at her with something between pity and disgust. "Hey, Victoria," he said quietly, "how could you not know? How could you treat anyone like that?" She had no answer. Because the truth was that she'd been treating people like that for years, just usually in more subtle ways, with more careful language in environments where she controlled the narrative. Last night she'd simply revealed who she really was to exactly the wrong person. Her phone buzzed with messages from other senior partners, clients, and business contacts who'd seen the news coverage. Each message was a relationship ending, a bridge burning, a door closing forever. By evening, the story had gone national. Federal judge presides over case of lawyer who discriminated against him, led news cycles across the country. Victoria Sterling became a cautionary tale about prejudice, privilege, and the dangerous assumptions people make about those they perceive as powerless. But the story wasn't really about her. It was about systemic change, institutional accountability, and what happens when someone with real power decides to use it for justice rather than protection of the status quo. 1 year later, the offices of Sterling, Blackwood, and Associates, now restructured as Blackwood, Martinez and Partners, bore little resemblance to the institution Victoria Sterling had controlled with prejudice disguised as standards. Judge Michael Thompson stood in the main conference room, no longer wearing his undercover disguise, but the respected bearing of a federal jurist who'd successfully transformed an entire industry's approach to civil rights. He was reviewing the firm's compliance reports when familiar voices made him turn. Judge Thompson, David Park, now a senior partner in the restructured firm, approached with genuine respect. "Thank you for coming to our diversity milestone celebration." Behind David stood Maria Gonzalez, the firm's new director of inclusive excellence, a position that hadn't existed during Victoria's reign. "Judge Thompson, the changes you mandated have transformed not just our firm but the entire Dallas legal community." Michael smiled. "How are the new practices working?" "Beyond our best expectations," David replied. "Our client satisfaction scores have increased 340%, particularly among minority communities. Our retention rate for diverse attorneys has gone from 23% to 89%, and our pro bono work has become a model for the industry. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Victoria Sterling had been disbarred after additional evidence emerged of her discriminatory practices spanning decades. Her departure had allowed the firm to genuinely examine its culture and rebuild from the foundation up. The mandatory bias training had evolved into ongoing education that helped attorneys recognize and address unconscious prejudice. The community service requirements had connected privileged lawyers with the immigrant families they'd previously dismissed or avoided. The $500,000 legal aid fund had grown into a $2 million foundation that provided free representation to families facing discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Judge Thompson. Maria said, "We wanted you to meet some of the attorneys we've hired since the restructuring." She introduced him to 3 young lawyers, immigrants, and first-generation Americans who would never have been considered under the old system, but who were now building successful careers serving clients the firm had previously ignored. "Your ruling didn't just change our hiring practices," one of them said. "It changed our understanding of what legal excellence actually means." Michael's phone buzzed with a message from the Department of Justice. Dallas model being implemented in federal compliance programs nationwide. Your undercover assessment methodology is being studied by civil rights divisions across the country. The ripple effects had extended far beyond one law firm. 12 other major firms in Dallas had voluntarily implemented similar diversity initiatives to avoid federal investigation. Law schools had added mandatory courses on cultural competency. The State Bar Association had revised its ethics requirements to include specific anti-discrimination training. That evening, Michael received an unexpected letter delivered to his chambers. The handwriting was careful, precise, and familiar. Judge Thompson. "I know you have no reason to read this, but I wanted you to know that losing everything was the beginning of the most important education of my life. I've spent this year working with an immigrant advocacy center learning the stories of families I once dismissed as not our kind of clients. I understand now that my prejudice wasn't just personal failing, it was participation in systematic oppression. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for forcing me to confront who I had become." The letter was signed by Victoria Sterling but included no return address or contact information. Just an acknowledgement of responsibility from someone who'd learned the hard way. That character is revealed in how we treat those we believe can't fight back. Michael read the letter twice, then filed it away. Transformation was possible, but it required genuine accountability rather than just legal compliance. Later that week, Michael spoke at a national conference of federal judges about undercover assessment techniques for investigating institutional discrimination. His presentation, titled, "Justice Requires Courage: How Hidden Identity Reveals Hidden Bias," had become required training for civil rights investigators. "The most dangerous discrimination," he told the audience, "isn't the kind that announces itself with slurs and burning crosses. It's the kind that disguises itself as standards, qualifications, and appropriate service. It's the prejudice that feels justified, professional, and reasonable to those who practice it." After the conference, a young Latino law student approached him with tears in his eyes. "Judge Thompson, my family owns a small restaurant, and we've faced discrimination from law firms when we needed help with business issues. Your ruling changed that. Now we have advocates instead of obstacles." Michael nodded, understanding that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about creating systems that prevented harm and expanded opportunity. That night, as he drove home through Dallas streets, Michael reflected on the evening that had changed so much. He could have revealed his identity immediately when Victoria began her tirade. He could have ended her behavior with a simple statement about who he was. Instead, he'd chosen to document the full extent of her prejudice, to gather evidence that would create systematic change rather than just individual embarrassment. Because real justice isn't about personal revenge, it's about preventing future victims. The immigrant Uber driver who'd been told he probably didn't have legal documentation had used his federal authority to ensure that respect, dignity, and opportunity were legally protected rather than just rhetorically promised. Victoria Sterling had learned that assumptions about power can be the most dangerous assumptions of all. Michael Thompson had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is patient documentation, followed by systematic transformation.